Now that Superman 2025 has been out for a while, I wanted to not only give my thoughts on it, but also compare it to past iterations. This video won't just be about the variations of Superman himself, but also the worlds built around the character. Not only will I compare the performance of each actor, but also the tone set by each primary director. Superman is my all-time favorite fictional character, so I won't deny having some bias towards him as a whole. First up, we have the classic Christopher Reeve films, with the original being directed by Richard Donner. Granted, he didn't direct all of the Reeve films, but his vision for the 1978 movie, along with a good bit of the second film, set the overall tone, color palettes, and performance of Christopher Reeve himself. These movies were taken more seriously than previous live-action incarnations, such as the 1950s George Reeves' Adventures of Superman TV series, but it was still very much intended to be family-friendly entertainment. While there was still some sense of campiness in certain aspects, like Lex Luthor being the self-declared greatest criminal mind of the time, it was nowhere near the levels of camp that had come before. In more recent years, the second Superman film did receive a director's cut treatment in which Donner's original plans for the film were restored to the best of the ability of those involved. Several elements were restored, such as Marlon Brando's Jor-El being put back in, plus the origin story of General Zod, Ursa, and Non being more closely related to the events of the first film. Superman 3, still directed by Richard Lester like the original version of Superman 2, saw a pretty big departure from the first two films, focusing more on Clark's past in Smallville rather than Metropolis. Many of the original characters either had their roles cut short or were gone altogether. In the case of Jimmy Olsen, he was split between Superman 3 and the connected Supergirl movie. There were intentions to eventually have both Superman and Supergirl together in one film, but that never really came to fruition back then. By Superman 4, budgets had been slashed and performers showed their fatigue. Even Christopher Reeve admitted to feeling the sequelitis of the time, and only agreed to do it if he had a hand in the story. Oddly enough, while this film is considered to be the worst of the Reeve movies, it's the one I remember watching the most as a kid along with Superman 2. It wasn't until I went back and watched all of the movies as an adult that the glaring problems became more apparent. Still though, I found myself enjoying all four films even with the dip in quality, because for me any Superman movie is better than no Superman movie. Overall, the Christopher Reeve films along with the universe that Richard Donner set up was a very bright, colorful, and lighthearted series that fit the comic book era of the times. Many people still consider Reeves' performance to be the benchmark for what Superman should be, and to me that is a very understandable position to have. Before I move on to Henry Cavill and the Snyderverse though, I would be remiss if I didn't at least acknowledge Brandon Routh in Superman Returns, especially since it was meant to be an extension of the Reeve films. At the time, in my opinion, Routh did an excellent job at capturing the essence of Christopher Reeve in his performance, but I just wasn't necessarily a fan of the story itself since it did sort of retread a lot of what came before. However, this film did produce what's still regarded as one of the best rescue sequences ever when Superman had to save the plane from crashing. Beyond that, while it's technically not a cinematic film, Routh did get to reprise the role on the CW's Crisis on Infinite Earths miniseries, and that alone shows just how good he could have really been if he had been given more opportunities. Next up, it's time to talk about Henry Cavill in the Snyderverse, starting with Man of Steel. First and foremost, let me clarify that I am indeed a fan of the Snyderverse, but not so much to the point that I was angry about Gunn recasting Superman, just disappointed because I didn't really want the stories to be starting all over again. I won't deny that there were some weird choices made in the origin story, like Jonathan Kent being killed in the tornado, or Lois knowing that Clark was Superman right out of the gate, plus there not being a true Fortress of Solitude, but I felt like the overall sense of gritty realism was better for the more modern times. Snyder intended for it to feel like how things would be if a godlike alien really showed up in our own world, and I thought he pretty much got that sense of things right. At the time, however, it was a very jarring difference and stark contrast to what people remembered from the Christopher Reeve films. Even though both incarnations ended the life of their respective versions of General Zod, the more brutal nature of Snyder's version made it feel less like something Superman would do. While many of the criticisms and concerns about Man of Steel were addressed in Batman v Superman, Batman himself was shown to be even more brutal and relentless than Superman was perceived, causing yet another uproar among fans. I remember countless discussions among friends about how and why Batman could have become so unforgiving, where I would explain things like the Robin suit being displayed in the Batcave and the story that image represented. Still though, while I understood the further criticisms of the Snyderverse, I was ecstatic to finally see the DC trinity of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman all finally on screen at once. Controversial story elements aside, I felt like the castings of Henry Cavill, Ben Affleck, and Gal Gadot could not have been a better fit for these versions of the characters. With that said, now it's time to move on to Justice League. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to ignore the 2017 version and only use Zack Snyder's Justice League for my comparisons. While BVS had shown just how dark the world these characters lived in really was, the Justice League was trying to turn that around with a more optimistic Batman who wanted to atone for his sins. Once the team was finally together and Superman back from the dead plus restored to full power, the team was lightened up and more hopeful than ever before. The resurrected Superman was closer to what most fans seemingly had wanted out of Henry Cavill's interpretation of the character. Sadly though, as we all know, his final appearance as Superman would take place during the end credits scene of the Black Adam movie. This, of course, brings us to James Gunn's Superman starring David Corenswet. While touted as a fresh starting point for the films, some elements will still carry forward from the prior Snyderverse films. To know what does or does not carry forward, the simplest statement Gunn provided for that answer is that if it's referenced in anything from the Creature Commandos animated series and onward, then it is still canon to the current DC universe. Superman 2025 is a much more lighthearted take on the character than the Snyderverse was. Granted, there were still some serious and realistic stakes in the film that could be connected back to things going on in our real world. The portrayal of such events and how they're handled is much more hopeful, and maybe even a little cartoonish at times. However, I do not say that like it's a bad thing. In watching the new film, I was heavily reminded of the 90s Superman animated series as well as the subsequent Justice League series. After those cartoons went off the air, DC continued the animation with several animated films, using many of the same actors, such as Kevin Conroy and Tim Daly as Batman and Superman respectively multiple times. As those animated movies were gaining traction, I always said that if the live-action movies wanted to get it right, they needed to take inspiration from the animated series, and it seems like the Gunverse is doing just that. Overall, I would say that if the Christopher Reeve films could be perceived as too campy or goofy, but the Henry Cavill films could be perceived as too dark and serious, then David Corenswet's Superman sits right in the middle. Goofy enough to be fun family entertainment, but serious enough to tell a good story. Going forward, we know that Supergirl will have her own movie come out in 2026, and it was also just announced that in 2027, we will see Man of Tomorrow. The latter announcement was issued featuring some new art by Jim Lee showcasing both Superman and Lex Luthor. James Gunn has said that this movie will feature Superman and Lex having to team up against a greater threat. My money is on that threat being Brainiac. Well, what about you guys? Who's your favorite Superman actor? Which cinematic universe is your favorite? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching SeVilion Entertainment, a collector's commentary. My name is SeVil, and this channel is the evolution of SeVilion Collectibles, where I began by reviewing action figures and collectibles. However, the stories don't stop with just the toys. They connect back to the movies, TV shows, and video games that shape pop culture itself. Here, I dive into the history, impact, and nostalgia of franchises like DC Universe, Mortal Kombat, and WWE. Whether you grew up in the arcades, the toy aisles, or in front of a VHS player, this is where those memories come to life again. The voice that you hear is generated by artificial intelligence, but it is still a clone of my own voice. Personally, I struggle with speech impediments and other disabilities that can make creating videos such as this more challenging than average, so Maya Eye Companions help with that to make all of this that much more efficient. The Lionhead logo was created by Brian LeBlanc Fantasy Art, and all music has been created by RJ Hughes. Be sure to drop a like and subscribe for more content from me.